I wanted to start off this episode by saying a huge thank you to all of you that have been reaching out to me, saying that the episodes resonated with you or that you found them helpful, resourceful. It means so much to me, and that's exactly why I've been doing this podcast. I also wanted to ask that you please continue to support us. You can do this in several ways by subscribing below, like, or if you wanted to hear certain stories going forward, do drop a comment and we will definitely listen and look around for stories that suit your needs. And now moving on to this episode.
I was sexually abused as a child, but I never told anybody. I didn't tell any of my friends. It was just not something I thought about, talked about. It was very deeply shameful to me. I had really struggled with my weight starting in my teens. I would gain and lose massive amounts of weight, like 50 to 75 pounds every 2 years. I have issues with my job. I have issues with my weight. I have issues with men. And she was like, no, you have one issue. It's you. You hate yourself.
This really, really powerful interview, we dive really deep into Patty Cabot's life. She courageously shares her story of overcoming childhood sexual abuse and the kind of profound impact that it had on her and her body image and her weight. And she spent several years of her life believing that her weight was the reason why she was struggling in relationships. She eventually embarked on a decade-long transformative journey towards healing. And through this, she unpacked the trauma that she experienced at a young age and slowly started to heal from it. So in the episode, we talk about EMDR therapy, which was a huge predominant part of her treatment. But along with that, she also tried chiropractic care, sex therapy, group therapy, and she persisted. She believed in what she was doing, and eventually she was able to find peace, comfort, and relief. Patty, welcome to Multispective. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Jennica. I'm delighted to be here with you.
So I've had a read of your book, and I find it so fascinating. Your story, your journey, the way that you have sort of like taken the steps towards like looking after yourself and recovering through this journey. And I can't wait for our listeners to hear. We're going to be taking a slightly different take this time to our listeners, and we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the therapy of and the healing journey of your story, because I feel like that's something that our listeners are going to really be able to take away. And you talk about it in great detail in your book as well. So why don't we start off by telling us a little bit about your book, because this is one hell of a book, guys.
Well, thank you so much. And as I was sharing with you, I ordered copies and I got them yesterday. So the timing is perfect. I'm going to hold it up. It's called Not That Girl Anymore.
Amazing.
And basically it really is about my journey to what I used to always describe as the other side. And the other side was where I wanted to be. And in so doing, I really did become not that girl anymore, the one that I had been. And in brief, and I'm happy to redirect, but I was sexually abused as a child, and which really was not, I don't want to say that it wasn't a part of my life. I was always aware of it, but I never thought about it. It was something that I pushed away, which I think is very natural. Anything traumatic that happens to you, you kind of tamp down, you move forward, you live your life. But I had really struggled with my weight starting in my teens. I would gain and lose massive amounts of weight, like 50 to 75 pounds every 2 years. So depending on when you saw me last, there's no telling how thin or heavy I'd be. And I was fantastic at dieting and I would always lose it, but I couldn't maintain it. And as the years kind of went by, I kind of started becoming more and more isolated from men. I just kept locking myself away. And when I was in my late 30s, like I was just exhausted by my weight. And I finally decided to see somebody who dealt with eating disorders. And when I met this therapist, we kind of went through my history and she was like, it's not about your weight. It's about your sexual abuse. And your weight is just a symptom. And that started everything for me. But truly, the catalyst was my weight. And it
Right.
just so happened it wasn't about that at all. Um,
Yeah. No, it's so typical of us, though, like as humans, to to look at the physical symptoms and try to treat that first. And we sort of like go backwards that way. You potentially maybe start medicating first before you actually realize, hey, it's actually so much deeper than that. So it does make sense to me that your method was first to treat the eating disorder. What made you go to a therapist as opposed to, I don't know, like a dietitian?
So I have been in and out of Weight Watchers. I think it's called WW now. In and out of Weight Watchers too many times to count. And I was always very successful at it. I mean, truly, I am a great dieter. I'm very disciplined. I'm in or I'm out. So if I'm in, I am all in. Um, so I had great success dieting and losing weight, but I could never maintain it. And I was like, how is it possible that I can't maintain it when I'm so good at losing it? So it really isn't rocket science. And I had actually seen a therapist in my early 20s, also about my weight, but about some other things too. And, it's interesting. At the time, I was so unhappy and so anxious and so stressed out all the time. And just everything. Like my life was just overwhelming to me that we really focused just on like kind of day to day, getting through the day. And at the end of my time working with her, which was torturous for me, I mean, the thing about therapy, and you and I had talked a little bit about this before, was I was very, very closed. So I literally thought it was intrusive if somebody asked what I did over the weekend. So for me to go into therapy and share how I felt was just a nightmare. I would literally meet with this therapist. Again, I'm in my early 20s. I would sit on the couch facing away from her. I couldn't even look at her. I mean, and then I would go home and like take to my couch. It was a nightmare. So I did get a lot of relief with kind of my anxiety and how miserable I was, but I never made any traction on my weight. Like the things I went in there with to present her, I was like, I have issues with my job. I have issues with my weight. I have issues with men. And she was like, yeah, no, you have one issue. It's you. You hate yourself. So it's so interesting that you could only even grapple with what's kind of like in your immediate line of sight because it's all so deep. So I worked with her for 8 years. I went twice a week for 8 years. And then I decided I had enough of therapy. Again, I made a lot of headway, not where I had hoped. But I did make a lot of traction. And then I started my usual dieting again because I'm still dieting. I'm still doing this. I'm still doing that. And then when I had really decided, it just got to a point where I thought, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in this cycle of gaining and losing weight. And I just didn't have the energy for it anymore. So I was like, you know what? I am going to find somebody who just deals with eating disorders because it is out of sight to me. I can't figure out what the issue is. And I think my big takeaway for anybody is if you battle the same issue repeatedly, you're focusing on the wrong aspect of it. It's about something else. Because again, it's not rocket science. We all know how to lose weight. And if you can't seem to make traction, there's something else driving it.
I wanted to share with you a counseling service that means a lot to me and has helped me in more ways than one. Community Center Shanghai is a Shanghai-based counseling service that provides both online and offline therapy sessions. With 30 experienced counselors speaking 11 different languages, they provide sessions at rates scaled according to your income level so that you never have to neglect your mental health again. I personally believe everyone should try therapy, regardless of whether you are stuck and struggling or not, as it's such a great way to explore yourself and your potential. As a person with anxiety, I have tried therapy and learned not only how to better cope with it, but also how to have healthier relationships and conversations with myself and healthier relationships and conversations with others. If you are or you think anyone around you might be struggling, please reach out to Community Center Shanghai. Their team is extremely helpful and responsive. You can find the website for Community Center in the description below. Thanks. And now back to the episode. Yeah. Deep down inside, were you able to make that connection that your weight gain and loss was to do with sexual abuse that you experienced as a child?
I never made the connection. Never. Which is kind of fascinating too. Like I said, it's not like I wasn't aware of what had happened. I just never thought about it. And I never shared it with anybody. I mean, my mother knew, but I never told anybody. I didn't tell any of my friends. It was just not something I thought about, talked about. It was very deeply shameful to me. And I actually remember when I was younger, I had told a camp counselor, and I was probably 11. And, she was probably 16. I mean, it was not
Oh.
somebody who was equipped to deal with what I was saying. And times have changed too. I mean, I think the world has changed a lot in the last 30, 40 years.
Hmm.
Um, so it's so much more prevalent now. It's so much more out there, and it's not as shrouded in secrecy. I still think
Hmm.
sexual abuse, particularly of children, remains a deeply shrouded, shameful thing. And I think it's
Hmm.
great that we are more open as a society to talking about other kinds of sexual abuse. But I still feel like when it comes to children, it is like still a world apart somewhere in some respects.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think that you're right in that there definitely are schools now that are trying to talk about it a little bit more, hold like social emotional classes, try to encourage students to like talk and share about what's sort of happening at home. But at the end of the day, this is still such a larger, issue at hand. At the end of the day, it's the individual shame that sort of is almost innate in us. Like as a child, it's funny because like we don't necessarily always know what is right or wrong, but yet when you're being touched in a certain way, you have this like deep-seated innate like there's something not quite right about this. And like even if schools and teachers and loved ones are encouraging you to like share, it's like it's a internal battle versus what our external situation is as well. And I think for you it was harder because it was family members, people you trusted and loved and felt closest to. Do you know if anybody picked up on any signs, like looking back on it now that you've shared your story with people?
Oh, well, what I think is that is so interesting that you say that. So I've had very, very few conversations with my mother about this over my life. And I did have one with her when I was probably in my 20s, possibly 30s. And she had said to me, so it was predominantly my stepfather, and she had said to me that after everything had kind of come out, she did divorce my stepfather. So good for her, because let me tell you, not everybody leaves the perpetrator. And that is
Mm,
heartbreaking to me when you hear about people where it's like you're basically choosing
mm,
a partner over your own child, and people do
yeah.
it all the time. It's horrible. Um, so my mother did leave him, which is great, but she told me when she divorced him, she found out he had made passes at her best friend, her sister, her mother, like all of these people. So this is clearly somebody with a sickness deep rooted, and either nobody told her, which again, shame on them, because they all should have had their eyes open to think what's going on in that household. So I
Mm,
think there's a failing there, I think, and it is easier for people to shut their eyes to what they don't want to see, right? You
mm,
just, well, I'm sure it's okay, kind of a thing.
yeah.
And again, I have
Um,
to say honestly, this is not unique to my mother, but I always thought, how could you not see? How could you not know? It's not like there weren't signs that things were a brew, that something was wrong, but you don't see what you don't want to see.
yeah. For her, it must be just so hard to see and accept that this is actually happening sort of under her nose, that it's like, I'm just going to deny it as much as I can. I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. Like, I can't, my brain is just not going to accept this and it would drive me crazy. So easier to just pretend it's not happening, right? Who was the other perpetrator?
My cousin.
Okay.
So again, within the family, and while I was never close to my stepfather, because again, I think I always, it doesn't matter how old you are, you just know when something's not right. So I was never close to him, and he was the predominant abuser, but I was very close to my cousin. So that one was a
Mm.
hard one for me, and it wasn't until I got older that I thought, oh, that's not right.
Mm. What
And
was the
even,
age
I'm
gap
sorry,
between, like the age gap between you and him?
it's more than 7 years.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's interesting. One of the therapies I talk about is group therapy. It was one of the things that I explored. And within that group, there's people on the spectrum of who their abusers are. And I think for all of us, it was within the family. One person it was within as well as outside of the family, which is horrible. Um,
Mm.
but there were a couple of people where it was a sibling. And because the age difference was much closer, like I think there's so much different. It's amazing to me how children take on all the blame, all the responsibility, like they become the ones that become they carry the burden, right, in every possible way, including assuming guilt. And I did too. I mean, that was like my big thing. It's all my fault. It's all my fault. And I think that I was buffered in a sense because there was kind of a big age gap between us. Whereas there were people in my group where it's a couple of years and they were like, how could I not, like it was different. It wasn't the same kind of preying on somebody much younger. But it is interesting. Everybody tortures themselves, and I don't care what the abuse is, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, sexual. The abused always thinks it's their fault. Like somehow they should have been able to, prevent it, outwit it, what have you, which is just sad.
Yeah. Can you talk to me, like looking back on this and after all the therapy, how did the therapist sort of make you understand that the eating disorder had a connection with the sexual abuse?
So when I started therapy and I started working with somebody who did EMDR, and I had never heard of EMDR, I looked up on a website board somebody for eating disorders, and I found her and she was great, and we started working together, and she explained to me that she thought it was about this, and I was like, okay, I don't really get it, but all right, whatever. And EMDR is really fascinating because it's really geared towards people with trauma. And again, it doesn't matter what the trauma is, but the thinking is that whatever kind of traumatic event you have, it becomes an explosion. So if your thoughts are like kind of cohesive and they all go on a track and that's how everything kind of makes sense to you, trauma blows up the track. And so when that happens, it's like it becomes all of this stuff kind of floating out there in space that suddenly doesn't make sense. So you just can't connect one thing to another. But again, it's not like it's on a conscious level. So when she and I had started working together, even when we started doing EMDR, which is really, really interesting, it's not, my way in was always my weight, because it was my weight that was so crushing for me. Like that's how I felt so bad about myself. It was all through my body and my weight, which again, I think is interesting too, because what better way to hate myself? Like I really viewed my body as the scene of the crime. So my weight became a way for me to constantly hate myself, right? It's like the failing of my body. And, interestingly enough, once I started working with her, my weight became the easiest thing to manage. So whether it made sense to me or not, what the interplay was, and we spent years trying to suss out what exactly is it about my weight, because even when I started losing weight and I've maintained it, it was really, it's still how the way you feel about yourself, the way you see yourself. So even if I was no longer gaining and losing massive amounts of weight, it still didn't mean that I wasn't still tortured by the way I looked. Right? Like it was that sense of ruin that was just always going to be there, which is why you can see people that look great to you and they're like, I hate my body. Well, because it's about something more.
Right.
Because objectively you could say, but you look fine.
Right, exactly. Was body dysmorphia a conversation that came up?
Yes and no. Because I had a number in my head, and once I got to a certain weight, everything was going to be great, right? Like all of my problems were going to be solved. I wasn't going to be battling my weight anymore. I was going to be thin. I was going to be perfect. I was going to have the love I wanted. Everything I wanted was going to fall into place, which doesn't matter what the goal is. It never happens that way, because one thing is not going to cure all the evils in your life. Having a certain amount of money is not going to do it. Looking a certain way is not going to do it. It's never that easy. If it were, we'd all be deliriously happy all the time. So when she would talk to me about it, I just wasn't ready to hear it, because I was like, no, I'm still not at that weight. And for a long time, she really wanted to work with me on kind of accepting where I was. And I was like, no, I'm just not there yet. Like, and particularly as it related to men, I was like, well, I'm not at the right weight. I'm not acceptable, which is of course nonsense too. You look around and there are all kinds of people, different shapes and sizes, that are in very happy, loving relationships. And it's not just about because they're X size or weigh X many pounds. It's got nothing to do with it.
Yeah,
So.
for sure. Let's talk a little bit about EMDR, because that was the first time that I'd ever heard or read about EMDR. Tell the listeners, what is EMDR? What does it stand for, and how does it happen?
So it stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a mouthful, and I had never heard of it either. I was like, okay, whatever. But EMDR, that's how you can find it. So there's different ways to do it, and so you can either do headphones, which is what I did. You can do taps in your hands, or they can tap your knees. There's all different kinds of things. And it's kind of like when you're in this like kind of right brain, left brain, thoughts and connections could be made a little bit easier. And so what you do in EMDR is it's a very long setup process to get there. And EMDR is supposed to help you work quickly, which was important for me. Not that I personally worked so quickly, but but in theory, I really wanted to. And so basically what you do is you set up a target, which is kind of like something you want to resolve. And so for me, once we got into my history, truly once I really started to focus on my sexual abuse, I always believed, and it was an intractable belief, that it was my fault. And so kind of my thing is that I wanted to work on, is it my fault kind of a thing? Because until I could let that go, I was never going to be able to move forward. And so you set up different targets about things you want to address. And, she would always start with, you would have kind of an image in your head. And then once you have this, syncopation maybe is the word. I just can't think about it. It's like kind of it's different thoughts and feelings. It's almost like stream of consciousness. Different things come into your head. And it's interesting that they all do ultimately lead somewhere, or they did for me anyway. But you can have many different targets, and I did over the years. And she would always start and stop with, what's the negative belief about yourself? What do you believe about yourself? So again, if it was that we were going to target my weight, it might be that no man will ever find me attractive, or whatever it might be. And you kind of work through that, but it's a process. It's not like a one and done when you're like, oh, well, that's great. I had this epiphany and now I'm cured. But it was really interesting and just kind of resolving things. Or so if you have a disturbing dream, you could go in and target the dream. And what's the dream mean? It's kind of those things, exploring different things that are kind of at play. I don't think that I did a great job of explaining that, but
I think that I do understand that. So we'll just unpack that a little bit. Firstly, is EMDR something that you can do at home, like on your own, or would you recommend it always to be with a therapist?
I would recommend it be with a therapist. I don't know that you would be able to get yourself into the same place without somebody leading you there. And certainly one of the things about EMDR, and I will say I have a pretty good ability about, I can leave something behind. So I can shut off at the drop of a hat. So like I can be in a mode and then be like, and I'm done, and move on and walk out and be happy. A lot of people can't. And one of the things you do when you're doing the setup for EMDR is it can be very triggering and very emotional for people. And it's like kind of making sure that you're at a place where you're able to walk out of your therapist's office and feel okay about what you're thinking about, what you're feeling.
Right.
So I would say for people that, especially people who really don't have a great ability to turn on and off, like you have to be compartmentalized to a certain extent. And I think I was very compartmentalized about what I thought about and when and how I moved through the world.
Right. And how long did it take for you to be able to sort of like actually tap in and like, hone in on those specific moments? Like, was it like a year of trying this, at every session, or was it like the very first session? She's like, all right, and 3, 2, 1, we're getting into it. And you're like right into the moment.
Yeah, no, that's what I was hoping for. That's what I wanted. And that is not what I got. And like I said, the setup at the beginning is kind of labor intensive because again, it's like you want to make sure that we talked about all these things. Like I would envision all these things that she and I would talk about, like storage for bad feelings. So if something awful was dredged up, like where could I put it? So again, at the end of the session, I could leave it behind. And then, or a happy place that I could imagine when I felt like I needed some place to escape to. So it's like you set all of this up. And then once you start, and I don't feel like this is a spoiler. My book kind of starts with me on the landing at my home. And so the landing of my home was my starting point in therapy. And it took us months before I could feel anything. And, you kind of target a memory, and I would target a memory and I wouldn't feel anything. And, you kind of start out small. You don't want something that's overwhelming. And because I couldn't feel anything at all, we kept getting to bigger and bigger, more important memories, more traumatic memories. And it didn't matter. I felt nothing for any of them. I was so disconnected from emotion with her. And we finally went back to talk therapy because it just wasn't leading anywhere. And she was like, the feelings are so difficult for you that your brain shuts them down before you can even process them, before they're even kind of real for you. And, we went back to talk therapy and then we would try again. So for me, it was a very gradual process. And kind of what came out of it was I felt nothing. And I don't think that's unusual either. When things happen to you, you kind of move through the world in a way that you can move through the world. And for me, that meant feeling nothing. So I was very disconnected from my emotions. And, I had tried all these alternative therapies and I had a lot of success with EMDR, but it got to a point, I think I was in therapy for 6 years and my weight was no longer an issue. It was always an issue in that it always tortured me, but outwardly I looked fine. So there is that distinction, right? And I think, unfortunately, part of being female, I think there is that I never look good enough. I never look good enough. And I think that never leaves. But it wasn't the same sole focus that it had been. And I still was no closer to meeting a man or anything else. And the first kind of alternative therapy I tried with my therapist, she was always in the picture, was I went through it's called chiropractic care. And I was like, I don't know how that works, but basically it's about things get trapped in the body, experiences get trapped in the body. And so the spinal cord is kind of your conduit to feeling. And I had met with this, I'm in New York City, I'm very lucky, there's like nothing you can't find here. And I met with somebody who did chiropractic care. And one of the first things he said to me, he was like, you don't feel any emotion. So, it's like everything's trapped. You're in a perpetual fight or flight. And working with him, I started to feel emotion and it's terrifying. Like it is. I found it so scary to feel things. And the only emotion I was ever comfortable with was anger. And anger is a very mobilizing emotion. So for me, I grew up in a family full of screamers. So anger for me was something that I was like, okay, I'm good with anger. But sadness, not even remotely was I good with that. Like it was terrifying to me. And I was very controlled. And there was nothing worse to me than being vulnerable. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Grease, but there's this song, There Are Worse Things I Can Do. And she goes through all of it. And she's like, but the worst thing I can do is cry in front of you. And that was how I felt, like to cry in front of somebody, to make myself that vulnerable. It would kill me.
So you talked about feeling lonely a lot in the book. You experienced that feeling of loneliness, but that still wasn't associated to sadness for you until you felt it?
I'm sorry, it wasn't associated through.
Like it wasn't associated with sadness, like that feeling of sadness, that emotion of sadness until you went through that chiropractic therapy?
I think I always felt lonely because I felt like there was no one there. And I always felt like I was somehow the black sheep in my family. Which is not to say that I didn't have, so I'm the youngest and I didn't have a close relationship with my mother. And I had no relationship really with my father. And I was no one's favorite. I have an older brother and an older sister. And so I think, while I was close to them, I just didn't have that same feeling of connection to my parents. So I think I always kind of felt lonely. And I was, my sister is a few years older than me too. And when we were growing up, she was much more social than me. Like I like to be kept away in I like to hide inside the house. So it wasn't like I was social. So I always felt very alone. And I think too, I felt very alone with what was happening. And even if I didn't understand it at the time, I felt safer alone, which is an interesting thing too. I think a lot of people feel that way. Alone is a safe place, right? Like, which doesn't mean that you're not slowly killing yourself by inches in any number of ways, shapes, and forms.
Yeah, for sure. You talked as well when you were doing your EMDR treatment. At some point, you did start to feel a very physical sensation, mostly in your arm. You could feel it in your chest. I found that really amazing, really fascinating, because I'll tell you, like personally, for me, I struggle a little bit with that, like placing my emotion and on my physical body. Like if someone was to tell me, where do you feel pain when you think about this emotion? It's hard for me to place it. Can you walk me through how did that become a very physical sensation for you?
So when I started making headway with EMDR, it really did become about a physical sensation first. And there's different kinds of therapy, and one of them, which I didn't really do, but EMDR touches on it a little bit. It's called somatic experience, and basically it's a way to tap into what you're feeling through physical sensations in your body. So for somebody who feels things a lot in their body, it's like a good pathway in to, again, understanding that while you might have certain thoughts and feelings, they're not always conscious, or you don't make the connection. So for a lot of people, somatic experience really can help them tap into what they're thinking and what's driving them. And EMDR, once we started to make headway, even before the mental stuff started coming, I started feeling physical sensations. And for me, the first one was my hands became numb and my right arm would become numb. And it's funny because my therapist would say to me, she's like, it's like your mind shuts off before it can have the thought, but it starts in your body. And for many years, we speculated about what happened, that my arm was always numb. Like, was it pinned under me? Was it trapped? Was it this? Was it that? And, all these different theories based on where I was at that point in time. But I really did have very strong physical sensations. And I would feel all this pressure in my chest. I would have, like, my stomach would be a whirlpool, and I would like see these things because EMDR is very visual too. You're visualizing all kinds of things. So, and it sounds so out there if you've never done it before. And I would say with any kind of alternative therapy, you have to walk in there with an open mind, which was not my strong suit, but you get there.
Yeah.
But it really was all about like tapping into how your body feels and then helping that make the connection mentally to what you're thinking about.
Right. Were there any sessions that you had where you felt it was like too traumatizing that you had to sort of like stop midway?
The only one I did that with was we were talking about my mother, and I was going to be seeing my mother. I was going to be visiting her. And I just kind of knew that it was going to lead to something that was not going to be good because I wasn't going to have another session for another couple of weeks, and I didn't want anything unresolved there. And, it's like for me, I could feel myself falling into certain kind of states, particularly when in the earlier days, like I really just so hated to show emotion. And that was part of my problem too. I think that in all honesty, I had a couple of barriers working against me that were totally self-imposed, but it's like you don't know at the time. One of them was that I really had conditioned myself not to be vulnerable in front of people. I felt like, and I still to a certain extent feel like people prey on other people's vulnerabilities. Not nice people, but people that are unkind,
Mm,
people that have their own agenda, they prey on that.
mm,
And I've seen it with other people, and will not allow myself to be kind of in that camp. So it's very hard for me to be vulnerable. I've gotten a lot better, but I went into therapy where I could not allow myself to be vulnerable, which is not a good thing to be doing if you're in therapy. So it was really a very long time before I cried in therapy. And it was like in the beginning, it was so hard for me. I didn't like crying. I didn't like being that emotional. So it was like I would kind of hold back and resist because I didn't want to be that vulnerable. And then
mm.
gradually that went away, which was great. And I think that enabled me to make progress. And I think the other thing that ended up being really limiting for me was that people have different goals. I had my own goals for therapy too. And in all honesty, I wanted what had happened to me to be undone. That was really
Mm.
I wanted something that truly was never going to happen. I wanted it to be undone because I felt ruined by it. And I didn't feel like I would ever be able to distance myself enough from it to kind of move forward and live a happy, normal life. So what I wanted was not attainable. And it was only kind of when I got to the point where I realized that is never going to happen. There is no, magic wand that's going to make that happen for me, that I was
Yeah.
able to do what I considered the impossible. And that was to integrate and accept what had happened and move forward from there. And I
Mm.
think that had I kind of recognized that earlier, that maybe it would have taken me less time. But, here's the beauty of that too. You can only do things as you're ready to do them. And when I started therapy, I would say, I'm very goal oriented. When am I going to be done? When am I going to be fixed? And she would say to me, I have no idea. And I was like, and I asked all the time, when am I going to be fixed? When am I going to be fixed? And she was like, there's no way of knowing. She's like, I don't know. You don't know. We just don't know. You're going to get there when you get there. And it's like, oh, for the love of God, that's not what I want to hear. But it was a mercy. Because it ended up taking 12 years, and not, which is not to say it would take anybody else that amount of time, but I had very specific goals for what I wanted. And even though I achieved all of these other goals along the way, I still didn't have what I wanted. So I kept going. And I think my two greatest strengths are that I am resilient and tenacious. And both of those things can be taught.
Yeah.
So if you don't have them, do not despair. It's like anything else. You want to learn to play the guitar, it's work, but you can do it.
Yeah.
Resiliency and tenacity are no different.
Yeah, I really got that like sense from reading your book as well. It was like when you were suggested to like try group therapy, when you were suggested to try like, sex therapy, like all of those things that happen in its time, whether you were resistant or not, when you said, I'm going to do it, you were like, I'm going to do it.
And what's interesting too is that I'm very pragmatic. So it's not like I believe in magic. I'm very practical and pragmatic. And what was interesting about therapy is that, again, it's not like it's a zero-sum game. Every day that you do it, so I would encourage anybody, every day that you do it, you take away something that helps you down the line. And, if you're lucky, time goes by. And as time went by and I got a little better and a little better and a little happier and a little bit more open, the more desperate I became, the more open I became. So when things were proposed to me, and group therapy was a great example, that was the first thing she had suggested to me. And it was a hard no. I was not doing it. It was not something I was interested in, and it was a closed door for me. But as I tried all of these things, I still didn't have what I wanted. So I became more and more desperate. I also became more and more open. So I was willing to try all of these things that I had initially thought, there's no way on God's green earth I'm doing that. Even chiropractic care, which was the first thing I tried, it was based on touch. And I didn't like to be touched. And I thought, am I going to be able to do this? But I was. Like, enough time had gone by that the thought of being touched wasn't as off-putting to me as it had been 5 years before.
Right. Especially considering it was a male that was going to be doing it as well. So, that in itself must have been so intimidating for you at the time. Yeah, I found that chiropractor therapy to be really interesting. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about how does that work and like what was he sort of doing to help you?
Yes. So when it was suggested, and again, it was the first alternative therapy I tried in conjunction with my therapist doing EMDR. And we both felt like I was stuck, and I had made so much progress over the years. I think I was in therapy for 6 years at that point, and I had made a ton of progress. But my whole goal of everything with my weight, it was all about me opening myself to love. I wanted to be in a relationship. I wanted to find this great love. And it was seemingly out of reach for me. And again, going into it, I thought, well, it's because of my weight. It's because of this. It's because of that. I don't look the right way. And, once I was at the weight I wanted to be, or close enough to it, it was like, well, that really shouldn't be such a big inhibitor. And I was like, how is it like even statistically possible that I can't meet someone? Like, I live in New York City. I should be able to meet somebody. And I couldn't. And so when we were talking about the ways to get me unstuck, one of the things that came up was this, it's called chiropractic care. And basically it's based on the spinal cord, and it's like this therapist or chiropractor basically makes light taps on your spine or different parts of your body, and it's supposed to release emotion that's kind of trapped inside your body. And honestly, it feels like they're doing nothing. And so again, it's like magic somehow. And, when I first met with him and he explained it to me, and he had said, he showed me a skeleton, and he's kind of going through, the way your body stores trauma and all this other stuff. And he said to me, the heart emanates energy like 80 feet out. And I was like, I feel like I project closed 80 feet out. And he's like, that's not who you are. And I was like, oh my God. So basically, I sign on, and it's, what they do is, once I started with him, he had 5 tables in his office, and people would come and go. He had office hours, and it's like 10 minutes. It's not like you're there for a long time. And he's like tapping, and there's other people. And somehow or other, it does open you up. And when I first started seeing him, I was very sad. I was like very emotional and very sad. And he had asked me, he's like, "How are you?" And I was like, I'm really sad." And he's like, "It'll pass." But it's like, it's about your letting go of these emotions. And when he had first met me and he assessed me and he asked if he could touch my sacrum and, like was tapping down my body, and he was like, "You are completely rigid." He's like, "You are flexed and braced for danger, and that's how you move through the world." Like, and it's funny, you were talking about back pain or this, that, or the other thing. I run, and that had come out of EMDR that I started running, and I still run and I love it, even though it's hard for me and I'm slow. But one of the things that I battled like all these injuries as a result of running. And he had said to me, he's like, your right leg is shorter than your left. And he's like, and it's not because my right leg is shorter than my left. It's the way I hold tension. He's like, you're twisted. So your hip is twisted. So your leg is, excuse me, shorter. And within 2 sessions, like my legs were the same length again, because it's like I was able to let go of like that stress that I was carrying there. So honestly, when I was seeing him, like my running was never so good. Like
No, that's amazing though. That's so interesting. And I can see why. Like it's all about that muscle, right? Your muscles are like just tensed in certain places. And this sort of explains why certain people have digestive problems. This sort of explains the anxiety that a lot of people experience, like, why we have aches in our bodies. A lot of it is just like from years and years and years. There's even like, dentists that notice that like certain people have like jaw pain and like locked jaw. That's all about your muscles just being tensed for just so long. And yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I do have dental problems, and I did start wearing a night guard years ago because my dentist was like, "You grind your teeth," and it's because again, everything was always so flexed and just like rigid, and you do, and
Right.
it's like unfortunately, you don't even realize that you're doing it.
Right. Do you have to be like fully trusting in the process and do you have to be fully in tune with it in order to work? Because I remember you were talking about how some of the other ladies over there were like moaning and groaning, and that was just sort of like such a massive distraction to you, and it made it really hard for you to. Do you feel like that affected like the progress of your experience too?
I do, and I think that you have to be open to anything you're trying, or as open as you can be, and also recognize what will and will not work for you. So, and everybody's different. Some people are very relaxed, some people aren't. I would fall into the latter camp if I'm not very relaxed. And I definitely did walk into chiropractic care with not liking to be touched, which is interesting because and that was one of the things that drove me to realize that I needed help was something had happened that made me feel like, wow, people perceive me as being so closed, which I was, but I'm friendly and outgoing. So I was like, how does that dovetail that this is still how people perceive me? And so when I went to meet with the chiropractor, it was a one-on-one. And I had no conception of what it was like when he was actually working his magic on people because he had open office hours. And even though I saw 5 tables, I didn't make a connection. And when I started going to his open office hours and there were other people there, I was like, all right, that's a little weird, but okay. Everybody's wearing their clothes. It's not like anything's happening. But after I had been there a little bit, like there are people that, and he and I had lots of conversations about this. There are internal and external processors. And internal processors keep everything inside, right? External processors don't. They like to talk about it. That, their experience becomes everybody's experience. And depending on where you fit in the spectrum, again, I'm internal. Like it would have, I can't even imagine being able to emote in a room full of strangers the way these people did. But it was very distracting to me. And it got to a point where it was triggering for me, especially when people were moaning or crying, or it made me feel trapped and helpless. And what it was doing was it was triggering me back to when I was young, and whether I could have ever called out for help and kind of the way I perceive these people to be or not, it was tremendously triggering, and I felt very unsafe, and I was not at all relaxed, and I was clearly not going to make progress. And to his great credit, we talked about it, and he ultimately ended up seeing me alone because I was like, had I realized this was the dynamic, I would have raised it as a red flag from the start because I'm not naturally relaxed and open.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
But again, I think there is no right or wrong with certain things. And even one of the things too, when I first embarked on my journey was I met with several therapists before I found the one that worked for me. Not everything
Mm,
works for every person, and that's okay. You have to find what works for you.
right. So I remember like after you'd ended things with the chiropractor, you continued on with EMDR, and I think it was around this time where you were sort of like tapping into certain scenarios, and you were actually able to control or change the whole narrative that was happening around you. So I don't remember if it was before or after, but you mentioned that you talked about like you being able to go to the scene, protect the small girl that was there
Oh,
lying in bed that was going through the trauma, and kind of like wrap a blanket around her, pull her out of the scene. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Is that an important aspect of EMDR therapy where you are actually changing the narrative? Yeah.
I think it's so individual based on what somebody's history is and what they're struggling with. But part of EMDR, and I think that early on when my therapist and I were doing EMDR and we were going back to things that happened when I was young, and again, the landing was this very kind of, it represented everything that happened in my life boiled down to one event. Like it really did become like the one thing that I would focus on because it represented so much to me. And mostly it represented my own culpability because I felt like I had placed myself in a position of danger, unwittingly so, but I had still placed myself in a position of danger. And that was like my great unforgivable sin. So the landing, me being on the landing, was very resonant for me. And when we started doing EMDR and I started making progress, one of the things that, and again, EMDR, there's no right or wrong, and it's very individualized. And kind of the images that come into your head are specific to you. And it's not like you're controlling them, which is why I kind of equated it to stream of consciousness, which I don't think that's necessarily accurate. But it's not like you're consciously projecting something or picturing something or imagining something. It's just spontaneous. And I would see myself at different ages. And I had a very hard time with that. And I did. And I'm 57. So I am of an age where, like in the 80s, I feel like there was a lot of talk about your inner child. And quite frankly, I thought it was nonsense. And I was like, this is just irritating. So like when this would come up for me, I had this bias against kind of these feelings of like these childlike parts of me. And my therapist was always like, they're parts of you, they represent parts of you, and you have to kind of accept it and just kind of go with it. And I did. And I always saw myself, I had like three different ones that were me at different ages. And as kind of our work continued, my therapist would always say to me, she's like, part of you is still in that house. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter that you're safe. It's like trauma happens and it cuts you off at that moment in time. So these parts of you, even though there are other parts of you that have been successful, that have friends, that have, a career, that have all of these things, different relationships, the part of you that was traumatized at that point in time is cut off. So it's like it becomes static. It never moves forward. And so her whole big thing was like, until you address what happened then, that part of you, the way you felt then, you'll never be able to get to where you want to be because that part of you is still driving things somehow. And I had multiple parts. And so it really did become about me trying to rescue these different parts of myself so that I could move on. And so at that particular point, the reference that you're making is, I saw this very young part of me, that again, my shrink would be adamant about. She's like, she's still in that house. You have to get her out of the house. Somebody has to rescue her. And honestly, when we started that, I was like, this too falls under the heading of bullshit. Like, I can't change what happened. I can't redirect it. And she was like, but you can. The beautiful thing about your mind is that when you're thinking about certain things or you try to imagine certain things, it's like your brain gets rewired. Like you're so facile and so nimble that even though it doesn't change what happened, it changes the way you view it and perceive it. And ultimately what happens is it becomes less painful. Like, and that's kind of the goal, for it to become less painful. So in that
Yeah,
particular instance, yeah, I did. It's like I would go rescue these different parts of me.
yeah. And it's like it's so powerful to like, tap into those moments and like be like, it's no longer going to define me in this very particular moment. I am taking control of the situation. I'm doing what I could have done, or like, what I wanted to do or experience at that very moment. I am doing it now, and I'm undoing all of that. I find that really, really powerful. I've done a couple of episodes as well in the past with guests who've talked about trauma and actually going back into it, but all have also emphasized the importance of having a therapist there to be able to help direct you in those situations, to say, yes, you can and you will. You are going to turn this around now. Because again, like you mentioned as well, for you, it was like, no, what are you talking about? How? You needed someone to almost like be on your corner, have your back, and kind of like assist you in that, final step of like turning it around. I'm going to jump now into relationships, how that, your therapy sessions also sort of inspired you and empowered you to start putting yourself out there. I was just like, when I was reading that scene about you going on your first date, having your first kiss, and like you for the first time telling someone who was sort of like a stranger, but a date, about your situation, and ergo why I can't, I haven't gone through too many sexual experiences, or this is why I'm very uncomfortable about these things, as opposed to just saying, no, I'm not comfortable with it. You were for the first time opening up about that. Tell our listeners a little bit about that.
So that dating, and it's interesting, in a lot of ways, I am very much your stereotypical New Yorker. I am very direct. I am very bold. And, I don't lack for confidence in a lot of ways, except when it comes to men. And it's because I really feel like I never felt entitled to say no. So whatever somebody wanted of me, I felt like I couldn't refuse. And so when I kind of realized, I put myself in unsafe situations with men. For starters, I would get wasted, I would go out, I would hook up with people. I wouldn't have sex with them, but I would put myself in unsafe situations. And I just kind of stopped. I retreated from the world, and I was like, this is just not good. I can't be doing this. And then when I was ready to start dating and like exploring this, I had a really hard time with, if somebody was nice to me, if somebody was interesting, if somebody was whatever, and they wanted to go out with me, I didn't feel like I could say no, even if I wasn't attracted to them, even if I didn't want to. So it just became easier again. Or if somebody I did kind of have an interest in wanted more from me than I was willing to give, I didn't feel like I could say no. And I couldn't set the boundaries that would make me feel safe. And I think that's really common too. And I just stopped battling against it. So like I retreated again because I couldn't protect myself. And I think I did kind of have an epiphany at some point where I thought, my issue with dating and men was always that, what's normal behavior? And I kind of talk about in my book, I didn't like kissing because of experiences I had with my cousin. And so kissing is really how you start and end dates, right? And so I felt like, because that was so uncomfortable for me, how could I go out with anybody? How can I explain to somebody why I don't like to kiss? And again, it was just easier not to go out. And I would grapple with, what's normal behavior? What should I be doing? What should I let someone do? And it really was never about, what do I want? It was always about, what do they want? And what do I have a right to say yay or nay to? And I kind of had this epiphany at some point where I thought, if I really like someone and he really likes me, it's going to be easier for me to distinguish between what I want and don't want. But I was always in this position where I kind of felt like I was with men that I really wasn't interested in. And I had a friend who had a theory. She's like, you only go out with men you're not interested in. I was like, well, I don't think that's true. But I also felt like no one was interested in me. So I felt like beggars can't be choosers kind of mentality, which is demented in its own right. But
Yeah.
so it really was about finally getting to a point where I thought, it doesn't matter what the norm is. What matters is how I feel. And in many respects, it's all that matters. All that matters is how I feel about it. I'm in control, and I'm in control of me.
Yeah. Do you feel like to an extent it not necessarily gets easier, but do you feel more power over your story the more you talk about it and share it?
Oh, I absolutely think everything gets easier the more you do it. The first time I told anybody that I was sexually abused, I was in my 40s, and it was my best friend, and it was horrible. like I uttered the one terse statement and that was done. I couldn't have a conversation about it. And then I started telling my close circle, and with each person it became easier. And when I decided to write my book, I had thought, well, I'm not really sure why I would be writing it. I felt like it's what I should be doing. I felt like it was my sign from the universe. This is what I'm supposed to do. But I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I really honestly had no idea. And publication was not my end goal. And it took me a couple years where I was really working on it, and I thought, oh, well, maybe I should publish it. And I kept checking in with myself, can I, can I, can I? And I still do it now. It is still something that is deeply personal, and it's like weird for me to be telling people that I don't know about it. It's just like one of those things, but every time I do it, it's easier and easier and easier. I mean, and I
Hmm.
think the old me, if you had asked me 20 years ago, would you publish a book about what had happened? I would have said absolutely not. And I would have thought I had a better chance of being the Queen of England. Like for me to, like in many respects, let myself be a poster child for childhood sexual abuse, what could be worse? What could be worse? And when
Hmm.
I was in my early 20s and I live in New York, and there was a story about this young woman who was found murdered and naked. And I thought, well, thank God she was dead. Like the thought of being found naked and alive seemed worse to me. And that's what this is all about. It's like being naked. And I did not like being naked literally or figuratively. Like naked is a vulnerable place to be. But
Right.
everything gets easier the more you do it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it seemed like when you were telling your friends about it as well, like they were so mature and calm and kind about it, and to an extent also like they started pouring their heart out about their own life experiences. And while it was obviously not anything like yours, it was sort of like to an extent brought you both closer on a different level, got you guys to understand each other on a totally different sort of level. Um, so yeah, that's amazing.
And I do think that's true. And, when my therapist kept encouraging me to tell my friends, and I was like, no, 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 no. And she was like, they're not going to judge you. And she would say to me all the time, how would you feel if it was reversed? And I would be like, well, of course I would want to know. Of course I would be, compassionate. Of course I would be this. She's like, and you think your friends are any less than that? And it's like, no, I think my friends are amazing people. But again, it's that intractable belief that revealing there really were, and I don't mean this as hyperbole, in many respects I thought telling would be the death of me. I just could not imagine a scenario in sharing that about myself that wouldn't just somehow lead to my utter destruction. And again, I
Hmm.
think it just being vulnerable what made me feel so unsafe. And the chiropractor, he had said to me early on, he's like, I want to help you believe that you can be in control without being controlling, and you can be vulnerable without being powerless. And I was like, that is not possible. And you know what? Guess what? It is possible. And that's my other big takeaway. What seems impossible isn't, it's a failure of imagination because it's not your experience. So you think, of course, that's not true. Of course, that's not true. But it is true.
Hmm.
I am far less controlling than I used to be. And I am willing to let myself be vulnerable now in a way that I never could have dreamed of.
Right. Do you feel like there's some um like power as well in sharing your story with the purpose of helping others? Do you feel like that in itself, the nature of that in itself as well is very,
Yeah.
help?
And I think that that became the driver of why I was going to do the book. I knew my story. And, I think that people have so many different reasons for writing books. And mine really was about the fact that I went on this 12-year journey, which again, a mercy, I had no idea it was going to be that long. Um, because I was single-mindedly focused on achieving one objective, and that was opening myself to love, which, spoiler, I did, which is great. Um, but I thought that sense of ruin that I felt is not uncommon. It's just not. I mean, which is sad. And I wanted to show people that it is possible. Just about nothing is impossible, but it is about, I run, and there's like all these different sayings in running, and one of them is running the mile you're in, which is kind of the one that I live by. And that is, it's really about looking at things that can seem so overwhelming and daunting. So whether it's that I want to get my diploma and I have to go to night school and, oh, it's going to take forever and it's going to be so hard, or I want to lose 50 pounds, or whatever your goal is, just focus on now. What can you do right now? Worry about tomorrow. Just keep moving forward. And as long as you're moving forward, I mean, there's a reason for that whole metaphor about like the tortoise and the hare. Like the tortoise just keeps going and he gets there in the end. And it really is about just being able to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I like that. I really like that. Um, One last question I wanted to ask, actually two last questions, but one is, what was it like confronting your mom and in her role in all of this? And did you ever confront the perpetrator, Terry, is what you call him in the book?
Um, no to the perpetrator. When my mother divorced my stepfather, he was out of my life. And interestingly enough, he, while he did all of these things that kind of created the template that was me, he really has never been in my mind because he wasn't in my life anymore. So he was gone. And my cousin has been removed from my life. My mother is a very complicated one because my mother is still in my life. And my mother, and I say this in my book, there is no malice in my mother, but she was also very, and continues to be, she's very self-centered. Everything is about her. So I don't think she understood then. She does not understand now. I don't think she ever got the toll that it took on me. The one time that we really talked about it, I found her to be completely disappointing in her response.
Hmm.
Which I think is again not unusual. And I think people search for closure, and a lot of times it becomes very focused on, well, I need to confront so and so that I can have closure. And what I would say there is that you really don't, because a lot of times that's not possible either. People die. People are just unavailable. People are just disappointing and unwilling or unable to engage in the way that you need them to. And I think that I did achieve my own level of peace and closure within myself by myself in therapy. And by myself, I mean without their influence, but certainly my therapist was guiding me through all of it.
Right,
So I think that I did get there.
right.
And, I feel like I didn't answer your other question about did I feel like writing the book would help people? So I really did want to show people that it was possible. And I think the other thing too, and this just surprises me still, how many people have eating disorders that have also experienced sexual abuse, and there doesn't seem to be this clear linkage. And I think, not for everybody, obviously, but for a
Hmm.
lot of us, the two go hand in hand. And I think a lot of people are like me, very focused on their weight, very focused on the physical, as opposed to what's driving the behavior underneath. So if it helps anybody think to themselves, oh, well, you know what? Or even if it's not sexual abuse, but it's physical abuse or any kind of trauma, if you struggle with your weight and again, you can't make traction, there is likely something else much deeper driving it. Same with
Hmm.
alcohol, drugs. Like, it's not like anybody wakes up and says, I want to be an alcoholic. It's like there's
Yeah,
something else that you're trying to medicate, self-medicate.
right. Like just trying to like push it away, push
Hmm.
that thought, distract yourself from. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I will definitely be putting your links to your book as well into our description. But just one last question. What sort of message would you like to get away to our listeners today, in what they can do or how they can help others that they may see going through something like this? Just one plugin that you think our listeners should take away from this or your book.
I think if you see somebody struggling, it's hard to people can only share what they're willing to share. And I think that sometimes we don't know what to say when something awful happens to somebody. And it could be something that's their own secret that they're grappling with, or it could be something recent that happened to them, something that's difficult or painful. I think sometimes it's like we feel this need, like, well, I have to be able to fix it for them. And a lot of times you can't fix anything, but I think what is most helpful for me is sometimes you just want somebody to be sad with you or just kind of feel bad with you or let you feel bad. And so even if somebody's not ready to share what's going on with them, you can still be supportive just by being like, you know what, I get it and I'm sorry and I wish I could make you feel better, but it's okay that you feel sad. And if you're ready, if you want to, I'm here. But just kind of validating how people feel. I think that's really important, as opposed to just being like, well, how can we fix it?
Yeah. 100%. I feel like that's like a skill that's really, really hard for a person. I feel like this is one of those things that you learn as a therapist, or certain kinds of jobs where, you're really forced to learn. But even in like a sales job, you are taught to listen, but to provide a solution, or to, with an agenda. Whereas it's probably like only therapists out there that just listen, plain listen, and they have the skills to be able to just listen and sit with it and not try to find a solution right now. And I think that's sort of like the best way to sort of unwire certain ways our brain works, right? Like finding it within yourself, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just giving you permission to feel what you need to feel. Right? Like, and I will never forget this. This was years ago. A friend of mine had gone through a breakup and she was sad. And literally, I just sat there and cried with her. And so she had told another friend, she was like, oh, I feel so much better after I spoke to Patty. And she was like, well, what did she say that I didn't say? And she's like, she didn't say anything. She just cried with me. It's like, sometimes that's all you need, right? Somebody to just be there with you.
I like that. I really, really like that. Patty, thank you so much for being on air with us. I feel like I learned so much from reading your book. So listeners, please get a hold of this book. If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Trzcinski, Stephan, Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jennica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.